In the 19th century, the Dawson household purchased a residence at a price far too low to be credible. What they perceived as a fresh start evolved instead into a chronicle of seclusion, rejection, and disintegration. It was the story of a family gradually consumed by the earth beneath their feet. Follow the Shadow Book for further authentic narratives where historical fact and terror converge. Some tales were never intended for burial. The acquisition of the Dawson estate took place under circumstances that would eventually be characterized as bizarre, if not outright suspicious. By all outward signs, the clan had obtained what most would define as an incredible steal. The capital traded was significantly below the typical market value for a home of its scale and craftsmanship, particularly considering its location on the fringes of the village, where property values had been rising for a decade. It was the elder, Mr. Dawson, who pushed most aggressively for the buy. His demeanor throughout the dealings displayed pride and a self-assurance that bordered on hostility. He told anyone willing to hear that fortune favored those bold enough to take it. He presented the low cost as the logical outcome of his own tenacity, a victory of haggling rather than a red flag of circumstance. His spouse did not feel the same way. Witnesses remarked on her quiet carriage during the negotiations and her tendency to cast her gaze downward whenever the history of the soil was mentioned. She inquired several times whether others had occupied the space recently and why the house had remained vacant for such a duration. These questions went unanswered. The vendor, a man of few words, persistently sidestepped direct talk regarding the property's lineage. When cornered, he gave vague accounts of upkeep struggles and disuse. He offered no specifics, and no further details were volunteered. Files indicate that when Mr. Dawson tried to secure a complete copy of the title deed, he noticed several segments were absent. This was dismissed as a minor administrative slip, with promises that the issue would be resolved soon. No fix ever arrived. The physical frame itself bore indicators that might have deterred a less stubborn purchaser. The locks on the gateways were corroded, their internal gears resisting even the most forceful turn of the latch. Various timber beams showed abrasions inconsistent with typical age, long, shallow grooves that hinted at previous efforts at extraction or interference. None of these observations seemed to bother Mr. Dawson. He waved them off as mere annoyances, easily fixed once the group had moved in. The deal finished swiftly and without fanfare. Funds were handed over, papers signed, and hands shaken. The mood in the room was noted by one observer as tense, even if no open conflict broke out. What remained was a heavy, lingering quiet that made even the youngsters fidget as the final ink was set. To the Dawsons, the purchase was a high point. They saw the low price as a sign of luck, a prize for their grit and bravery. To the village, however, the closing of the deal sparked waves of discomfort. Residents maintained their distance. Their eyes followed the family, but their lips stayed sealed. When addressed, replies were short and topics were moved elsewhere. The family reached their new residence in the late afternoon. The cart groaned under the mass of their belongings. The children stared at the massive frame of the building with wide curiosity, sprinting toward the entrance before their mother called them back. Mr. Dawson stood with a straighter spine than usual, his chest out, as if this buy solidified his legacy. His wife stayed wary, peering at the glass panes as if expecting to catch someone looking back. As the family stepped over the entrance for the first time, a local man walking the path stopped to watch. He spat on the dirt, shook his head, and mumbled in a voice clear to those nearby that it should have remained vacant. The comment was ignored by the newcomers, though its reverberation would stay, like a note jotted in the margins of a ledger, unexplained but impossible to rub out. The initial night in the Dawson home was defined less by movement than by a chilling stillness. After the cart was cleared and the last boxes were taken inside, the family navigated the rooms with soft steps. Their footfalls rang out longer than they should have, as if the floorboards soaked up and then grudgingly let go of every sound. The house seemed to insist on silence, and in turn their speech faded to whispers. Dinner was eaten in a rush. The family sat at a temporary table, their utensils clinking against plates, while their main furniture sat in pieces. Talk focused on logistics, where the cots should go, how to organize their gear, and which fixes were most urgent. No one spoke of the air, though every person felt it. It was colder than the weather dictated, holding a subtle scent of wet soil despite the dry sky. When night settled, the lack of familiar noise felt heavier. The town's distant life barely touched the property, leaving the Dawsons trapped in a pocket of strange quiet. The children, used to the chatter of streets and passing wagons, became edgy. They murmured to one another as they got ready for sleep, their voices booming even in the dark. The building made its own sounds. Timber creaked at random moments, as if weight was moving in rooms that were supposedly empty. Supports groaned softly in the roof, a low moan that occurred without reason. Each noise, small on its own, built into a constant sign that the structure was never truly at rest. The mother tried to offer comfort. She blamed the sounds on the wood settling or the drafts common in old structures. She told the children to sleep and let their tiredness win over their fear. Her words, however, lacked real heart. She herself jumped at the bang of a shutter outside, followed by what she hoped was only the wind. Their girl, the youngest and most outspoken, said she heard voices by her glass. She claimed someone was talking from the grass in low tones, saying things she couldn't grasp. Mr. Dawson checked the yard and found no one there. He told her off for making up tales, but his own eyes stayed fixed on the dark edge of the woods for too long before he went back inside. Sleep, when it finally came, was thin. Every person in the house woke at intervals. Sheets were kicked, pillows were flipped, and sighs drifted into the shadows. The quiet of the home was not calm. It was a weight pressing on the ears, broken by sharp snaps that suggested movement. After midnight, Mr. Dawson got out of bed. His wife, half awake, noticed the careful way he left the room, though he said nothing. He walked through the hall, holding a flame that flickered under invisible currents of cold air. The doors he passed felt drafty, even though they were shut tight. Upon reaching the main door, he halted. The lock he had tightened earlier was loose. The bolt was open, though he remembered the struggle it took to force it shut when they arrived. He stood there for a long time, gripping the handle, checking the weight of the door. There were no signs of a break-in. The lawn was vacant. He shut the door once more, making sure the lock clicked. He pushed against it twice to be sure before blowing out the candle and heading back. He told his wife nothing of what he found. She, feeling his tension as he laid back down, asked no questions. The rest of the night was spent in bits of sleep. No one confessed in the morning to being rested. What remained was the feeling of being watched, a silence that felt like everyone was waiting for something they couldn't name. That first night ended not with peace, but with the realization that silence could be a foe. The family's first trip to the village after moving in was remembered not for what they bought, but for how they were met. They arrived as outsiders, yet they already bore a reputation they hadn't earned. The square, usually a place of busy trade, changed its pulse when they appeared. Talk died down for a second, eyes looked away, and the usual noise of the market resumed with a fake tone. Mr. Dawson walked with forced pride, his pace fast and head high. He saw the cold shoulder from others as jealousy, viewing the silence as proof of his win in getting land others had missed. His wife saw it differently. She noticed the side-eye and the whispers that trailed them from shop to shop, her grip tightening on her daughter's hand as if to protect her. The business was simple but awkward. The bakers and butchers finished their sales fast, keeping things short. Prices were barked out and change was dropped without a touch. When Mrs. Dawson tried to be friendly, people went quiet or changed the topic. She saw that the women nearby would look away, pretending to check items they didn't want until the Dawsons walked on. The children felt the chill, even if they didn't say it. The oldest boy grumbled about the town being mean, while the younger ones stayed quiet, their fun sucked out by the mood. Every step through the market proved they were marked, not for who they were, but for the soil they stood on. The most important talk happened at the general store. The owner, a thin man of middle age, paused before helping. He weighed the goods slowly, as if stalling. When Mrs. Dawson tried to be polite, asking about the shop's history and the land they bought, he stopped. His eyes darted around the room and his voice dropped. He said it was not a place for the living, his words heavy with more than just a guess. When she asked for more, he gave only pieces. He said the land had once been a dumping ground for those the world forgot, the poor, the sick, the ones nobody wanted. They were buried without a word or a name. He said, when the land was cleared later, no one cared what was left behind. His last words were vague but terrifying. Not all was moved. Mr. Dawson brushed it off with anger, calling the man a liar, trying to scare them away. He claimed the house was good, the ground was solid, and their life was set. He spoke louder than he needed to, trying to push back against the room. The shopkeeper said nothing else, his face going blank. Mrs. Dawson didn't speak, but she saw the shift in the people around her. Every time she mentioned her kids, folks crossed themselves, some moving so slightly they hoped not to be seen. It was a pattern, repeated by different hands, always after the mention of the children. The trip ended without a fight, but the feeling stayed. They went back to the cart with food, but with heavy hearts. Mr. Dawson stayed focused on his idea of envy, while his wife suspected the silence hid a truth they weren't being told. The children, quiet and restless, looked back at the town as if it had turned its back on them. That day showed that they went for supplies but left with something much heavier, the weight of a hidden history. The first few weeks in the home showed flaws that looked normal but meant something worse. It started with the children playing. They ran through the rooms until one of them heard a hollow ring. Each step on that one spot made a dull sound, unlike the solid thud of the rest of the floor. The kids pushed down on the wood, feeling a slight dip. They called their father, who ignored it at first. But the sound was so different that he had to look. He knelt down, tapping the wood. The hollow part was a thin line, suggesting either rot or a hole. His jaw tightened, but he told the kids it was just old wood. He sent them to another room. Once alone, he used a tool on the boards. The wood snapped easily, soft and dark. Under the broken timber, he saw rotting supports that smelled like dirt, even though there was no water. Deeper in that hole, he saw a piece of cloth. It was dirty, old, and rough. It was stuck to the soil as if it had been there for ages. When he pulled it, the fabric held firm, showing something hard underneath, something too shaped to be a root. Mr. Dawson pulled his hand back fast. He looked at the door to see if he was being watched. He touched the cloth one more time, just enough to know something was there, then let go. He chose not to look further. He put the wood back carefully, hammering it so no one could tell it had been moved. He made it look like a repair. When his wife asked what took so long, he said it was a minor fix. She believed him, though she saw the dirt on his hands. He never mentioned the object. He told the kids to play outside and stop them from going near that spot. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice to hide the truth. By covering the floor, he was burying the problem. The house had shown him a secret, and he had chosen to look away. The nights after that find were defined by a lack of trust. Everyone stayed awake, listening to the house. The parents were the first to hear it, heavy, steady steps in the hall at night. When Mr. Dawson looked, the hall was empty. He and his wife began to blame each other for the walking, leading to fights. The children were scared, unable to sleep. Their daughter changed the most. She became a ghost of herself, pale, thin, and quiet. She said she had dreams of being pushed into the dirt, of suffocating while earth filled her mouth. She said it so calmly it was terrifying. Her father called it an overactive mind, but her mother saw the dark rings under her eyes. The home grew cold. No one talked at meals. The kids fought and the parents grew apart. On the fourth night, the mother found her daughter in a state that made her heart stop. The girl had gotten up in the night. At dawn, her small fingers were black with dirt under the nails. She didn't remember leaving her bed. She only remembered the dreams and the taste of soil. After this, Mr. Dawson went to the town records. He didn't ask people, he looked at paper. He found the old land maps. The site was once a pauper's grave for a workhouse. There were no names, just lists of costs for cheap coffins. There were orders to move the bodies, but the notes stopped halfway through. There was no proof the job was done. He found a letter saying the bodies were never moved because it cost too much. He felt like he was being watched in that dusty room. He knew the truth now. His house was built on the forgotten dead. Instead of telling the truth, he burned the letters. He watched them turn to ash under his boots. But he kept one map, a map of the graves. He hid it in his coat. He went home and lied, saying the rumors were fake, but he carried that paper like a curse. The neighborhood stopped talking to them. No one would deliver food. Shops said they were out of stock. The family began to starve and turn on each other. Mr. Dawson's temper grew short as he realized they were trapped by a history he tried to burn. With no accomplishments to display for his labor, Mr. Dawson returned home to a house where a heavy, suffocating silence had taken root. The children no longer engaged in the play that once occupied their time. Their tentative laughter had vanished entirely, replaced by sharp disagreements or long, hollow periods of quiet, where each family member retreated into their own isolation. The mother struggled to maintain a semblance of order, scheduling mealtimes, lessons, and domestic chores, but her efforts were met with fading success. The youngest son, not yet of school age, showed the most alarming transformation. Previously a talkative child, he stopped speaking altogether, responding to inquiries only with a blank, distant stare. He began to obsessively fill scraps of paper with jagged, uneven lines, repeating the motion until the surface was blackened with ink. He carried these fragments everywhere, hiding them in pockets or under his mattress. When found, the papers were torn and smudged, yet the erratic patterns remained visible. His mother's concern couldn't coax a single word from him, while his father viewed the habit with sheer irritation, once burning a collection of the scribbles in the kitchen stove. The boy didn't fight back. He simply watched the fire consume them and immediately began the task again on fresh scraps. The air in the Dawson home became stagnant. Deprived of the relief of social contact or the support of local commerce, the family existed in a closed loop where every grievance was magnified and every silence grew deeper. Their daily movements became mechanical, stripped of any spark of joy. Evenings were spent in the dim glow of lamps, the parents barely speaking while the children hurried to bed. Passers-by described the property as a tomb. Curtains remained pulled tight, smoke rose only in fits and starts from the chimney, and the sounds of life were absent. The house, once a symbol of a new beginning, was now merely a structure occupied but not inhabited, its residents as distant from one another as they were from the town. Records from this time show no sudden catastrophe, only a slow, steady erosion of human connection. The Dawsons were not forced out by an external power, but by a starvation of the soul, left only with their own growing suspicions. It was in this state of abandonment that the boy's silence persisted, his secret papers multiplying like a mute testimony to a mind withdrawing from a crumbling reality. Mrs. Dawson's behavior during this season was a mix of intense wariness and hidden action. While her husband had dismissed the hollow sounds beneath the floor, she could not let the matter rest. Her anxiety peaked until, while he was away, she decided to investigate the spot herself. She told no one. Using basic household tools, she pried at the loose timber, widening the gap her husband had tried to hide. As the boards gave way, a faint scent of old soil mixed with something more organic and unsettling rose from the dark. Inside the hole, she saw remnants half buried in the earth. A piece of coarse cloth, typical of the garments given to the destitute, tore apart at her touch. Beneath it, she saw darker, irregular shapes, fragments of bone with edges softened by time. She didn't move them. The sight alone was enough to make her breath short and rapid. She met this discovery with immediate concealment. She didn't call for her husband or warn her children. Instead, she gathered the bits of fabric and locked them in a small personal trunk in her bedroom. The bones she left where they lay, covering them with dirt before hammering the boards back into place so the floor looked untouched. Her choice to remain silent was born of both terror and a weary resignation. She knew her husband would respond with rage or denial, having already proven he wouldn't face the truth. To challenge him with proof would only invite violence. For her, the house changed forever that day. She moved through its rooms with a new, sharp caution, her mind always pulled back to the cavity. That evening, as they ate a minimal supper, the tension was thick. Mr. Dawson complained of failed work, and the children ate with heavy eyes. Late that night, a sound came from under the floor. Not a wood creak, but a heavy, dragging noise against the beams. It lasted for moments before vanishing. Mrs. Dawson lay frozen in the dark, watching the ceiling, but she spoke to no one of it the next morning. By the midpoint of their stay, the household entered a phase of open hostility. Noise became the dominant force, shouts, crashing doors, and the constant bickering of children. The siblings turned on each other over food and space, their fights sometimes ending in blood. Mrs. Dawson tried to stop them, but her voice was lost in the din. The father's only answer was to roar for silence, using fear to quiet the room without ever offering peace. The eldest son, now nearly a man, began to challenge his father directly, demanding they leave the house. He argued that the isolation and the sickness of the younger ones proved the place was toxic. Mr. Dawson refused, citing the money spent and his own wounded pride. To him, leaving was a failure he couldn't endure. The mother's suppressed anger finally broke during one of these fights. She accused him of knowing the property's dark history before they bought it, suggesting the low price was a warning he chose to ignore. This accusation stunned the children. Mr. Dawson didn't argue or explain. Instead, he crossed the room and struck her across the face. The sound of the blow silenced the house. Mrs. Dawson gripped the table to stay upright, her head bowed. The children stared in frozen shock. The eldest son balled his fists, his jaw tight with a murderous look, but he didn't move. Mr. Dawson adjusted his coat and declared the matter over. This was the moment the family truly fractured. Authority was kept through force, but trust was dead. Mrs. Dawson eventually sought help, not for food, but for her spirit. She went to the parish rectory in secret, avoiding the neighbors. She spoke to the priest in a small, dim room, detailing the illness, the sounds, and the fragments she found under the floor. The priest listened with a grim, heavy silence. He admitted he knew the land's history as a pauper's grave for the workhouse, a place for those society rejected. He explained that while records said the ground was cleared, the work was likely never finished due to a lack of money and will. The earth was built over, not emptied, he told her, warning that the shame of the forgotten dead would cling to anyone living there. He urged her to flee, saying no good could come from such ground. She returned home to find her daughter kneeling by the trunk where the cloth was hidden, whispering to the air. When the girl saw her mother, she stopped, but her hands were still reaching for the lid. Mrs. Dawson slammed it shut and sent her away. She now saw the house not as a shelter, but as a lid on a grave. Meanwhile, the children's health grew worse. They suffered from high fevers, night terrors, and visions of figures in the corners of their eyes. The younger boys felt insects crawling on their skin that weren't there. When Mrs. Dawson begged the town doctor for help, he refused to come, making excuses about the distance. They were completely alone. The youngest son had a terrifying episode where he woke up gasping, clutching his throat as if an invisible weight was crushing his chest. His face turned dark before he could finally breathe again, sobbing that something had been pressing on him. Mr. Dawson watched briefly and then walked away, claiming there was nothing to be done. The eldest son began to plan an escape, hiding food and testing the windows. He told his mother, and she didn't stop him. She hoped at least one of them might survive. But Mr. Dawson found the hidden food and grew paranoid. In a fit of control, he took the heavy iron key, locked the front door, and pocketed it. He barred the windows and reinforced the frames, turning the home into a prison. The eldest son watched him with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. The house itself began to fall apart alongside the family. Beams groaned, the foundations sank, and cracks snaked up the walls. Mr. Dawson descended into alcoholism, his rage turning into a drunken, slurred stupor. Mrs. Dawson became a ghost in her own home, performing chores without a word or a thought. The children hid in corners like animals, guarding scraps of food from one another. The end came when the floor in the main room finally gave way with a thunderous crack. A massive hole opened, revealing a pile of jumbled human bones and rotted cloth. The family stood at the edge of the pit in total silence. Mr. Dawson, trembling, tried to claim they were just animal bones from an old farm, shouting the lie to make it true. But no one believed him, and no one moved to cover the hole. They simply stood there in the dust, listening to the walls strain as the house finally gave up its secrets. The children refused to believe his desperate lies. Their quiet faces were masks of recognition, seeing the truth of their situation for the first time. The elder son reacted with a raw, explosive fury. He shouted that his father was a liar, accusing him of knowing the property's dark secrets from the start and intentionally trapping his own flesh and blood within its walls. The rage that had been building for months finally erupted. When Mr. Dawson moved to strike the boy into silence, the son fought back with a sudden, desperate violence. His fists struck his father's chest and face with the strength of a man. Mr. Dawson, slowed by the weight of alcohol and exhaustion, could barely defend himself. The house filled with the sounds of a brutal struggle, the crash of chairs, the heavy thud of blows landing, and the ragged breathing of two men locked in a fight for dominance. The younger children wailed in terror as their mother, her face set in a grim mask, gathered them to her. She declared with absolute finality that they were leaving that very moment. She hurried the smaller children toward the front entrance, her movements quick and certain. Reaching the handle, she pulled with all her might, but the door didn't budge. She twisted the latch and threw her weight against the wood, yet the mechanism remained frozen. The heavy iron bolt, thick with rust and fused by decades of neglect, had become one with its housing. Even as the wooden frame groaned and splintered under her efforts, the door stayed shut. The children crowded behind her, their eyes wide with panic. The eldest son, breaking away from the brawl, threw his shoulder against the exit alongside his mother. The result was the same. The door was as solid as a stone wall. Behind them, Mr. Dawson roared through a bloodied lip, still refusing to admit the truth. He called them cowards and traitors, claiming they were throwing away everything he had worked for. Outside, the atmosphere broke. Heavy clouds that had been gathering in the dark unleashed a sudden, violent storm. Thunder rolled directly overhead, shaking the windows and vibrating through the house's fragile skeleton. Bright flashes of lightning cut through the dark rooms, illuminating the cracks in the walls that were now spreading like spiderwebs across the plaster. The entire building shuddered with every rumble of thunder, as if the sky itself were trying to tear the structure apart. The record of that moment is one of total entrapment. A mother and her children clawing at a sealed exit, a father lost in a haze of rage and denial, and a house ready to fall. The final night of the Dawson family is a story told through the wreckage they left behind. They huddled together in the main room as the storm raged on without mercy. The air was thick with the smell of wet dirt and rotting wood. No lamps were lit. The only light came from the jagged flashes of lightning that briefly showed their terrified, exhausted faces. There was no comfort in their closeness. The children turned on their parents with bitter words. The eldest son cursed his father's pride, while the daughter told her mother that her silence had been a death sentence for them all. Even the youngest boys, weak with fever, cried out that they had been forgotten. The house seemed to agree with their despair. A massive crack split the ceiling, mocking Mr. Dawson's claims that they could survive the night. Mrs. Dawson, her voice steady and chillingly calm, delivered the final verdict. "You bought us a grave. The earth responded immediately. A deep, grinding sound rose from the foundation as the ground began to shift. The floorboards pulled apart at the seams and plaster rained down like grey snow. With a final, thunderous roar, the center of the house gave way. The floor collapsed into the dark cavity below, dragging furniture, debris, and the family down into the hole. Black soil surged upward, bringing with it the ancient, shattered bones of the forgotten dead. It was a total reclamation by the earth. By morning, the house was a hollowed-out shell, leaning dangerously against the grey sky. No one ever saw the Dawsons again. No bodies were pulled from the wreckage, and no funeral was ever held. The townspeople who passed by in the following days saw only a dead house. No smoke from the chimney, no voices from within, only a heavy silence that pushed out from the walls. They whispered that the land had simply swallowed another family. The official records end there. The house sat empty and dark, its door still locked from the inside. The Dawsons, who thought they had found a bargain, became just another layer of the property's secret history. They were erased by the very soil they tried to own. If this account of history and horror moved you, join the Shadow Book for more. We uncover the tales of fear and denial that time tried to bury, bringing to light the lives that were erased by the weight of a dark and hungry past.